Real men don't chase. They walk away silently. Stoicism. Watch what a man does the moment someone pulls away from him, and you will learn everything about his character that 100 conversations could never reveal. The weak man chases. He calls twice, then 3 times. He rewrites the same message into softer and softer language, hoping a gentler phrasing might unlock a door that was never about phrasing in the first place. He shows up uninvited, mistaking persistence for devotion, when in truth it is simply fear wearing the costume of romance. The strong man does something almost nobody expects, and almost nobody can imitate convincingly, because it cannot be fake. He turns around. He walks toward his own life with the same steady pace he would use on any ordinary morning, and he does not look back to measure the effect of his departure. Seneca wrote that the whole future lies in uncertainty, so live immediately, and nothing captures that instruction better than a man who refuses to spend his one uncertain life waiting outside a door that has already closed. This video is not about pretending indifference you do not feel. It is about the deeper, harder discipline of building a life so complete that walking away from anything, or anyone, requires no performance at all. If you are ready to learn how that discipline actually works, subscribe to Quotes Library right now, because this channel exists to arm you with exactly this kind of wisdom, week after week. Let me introduce you to a man named Desmond Okafor. Desmond was 29, a structural engineer with a quiet, steady disposition, the kind of man other people described as dependable long before they described him as interesting. When Ifoma ended things after 2 years together, citing a need for space she could not fully articulate, Desmond's first instinct was the same instinct that destroys most men in his position. He began chasing. He offered to change his schedule to see her more. He offered to change his habits, his hobbies, the very rhythm of his days, as though the relationship's collapse were a math problem solvable through enough personal adjustment. He waited outside her office once, telling himself it was simply on his way home, though it was a detour of nearly 40 minutes. Ifoma grew quieter with each attempt, not because she stopped caring entirely, but because chasing has a peculiar effect on the person being chased. It transforms affection into obligation, and obligation is the fastest way to kill whatever attraction remains. It took Desmond nearly 4 months to understand what Marcus Aurelius understood 2,000 years earlier while ruling an empire during plague and war. That a man cannot control what others feel toward him, only how he conducts himself regardless of their feelings. Desmond's turning point arrived not through some dramatic confrontation but through a small, almost embarrassing moment, standing outside Ifoma's apartment building for the 3rd time in a month, keys still in his coat pocket, suddenly aware of exactly how this looked from the outside. He did not knock that night. He turned around and drove home in silence, and something in that quiet drive marked the beginning of an entirely different chapter, one built not around winning her back, but around building a version of himself he could respect regardless of the outcome. This video walks through exactly how he did it, and how you can do the same, whether the person who walked away from you was a partner, a friend, or an opportunity you desperately wanted to keep. Principle 1. Chasing announces weakness even when words do not. There is a particular kind of self-betrayal in chasing, one that operates beneath conscious awareness. Every call placed after silence has already answered, every message sent hoping for a different response than the last 3 received, every unplanned appearance at a place you know she frequents, communicates a single sentence louder than any words you actually say: I cannot function without your attention. This message is rarely intended, and it is almost always received anyway, because behavior speaks a language words cannot override. Epictetus taught that we suffer not from events themselves but from the judgments we attach to them, and the judgment hiding beneath most chasing behavior is the belief that being left behind proves something shameful about the man being left. That belief, left unexamined, drives otherwise intelligent men into behavior that actively confirms the very inadequacy they are terrified of being seen as having. Desmond's chasing phase followed a predictable pattern he only recognized in hindsight. Each rejection produced a fresh wave of anxious energy, and that energy demanded an outlet, so he directed it toward one more attempt, one more message, one more drive past a familiar building. The relief chasing provided was always temporary and always followed by deeper shame once the message went unanswered or received only a cold, brief reply. Real strength, the kind Marcus Aurelius wrote about in the private notebook that became Meditations, is not the absence of the impulse to chase. It is the discipline to notice the impulse, name it honestly as fear rather than love, and choose a different action entirely. Desmond began keeping a small notebook of his own, writing down the urge to reach out each time it appeared, without acting on it, simply observing the feeling until it passed on its own, usually within an hour, sometimes within a single evening. This single practice, watching the impulse without obeying it, became the foundation for every principle that followed. It is worth naming clearly why chasing feels so irresistible in the moment, because understanding the mechanism is often the first step toward resisting it. The human mind treats sudden loss of attachment as a kind of alarm, activating the same circuitry that once helped ancestors survive genuine physical danger. This alarm demands action, any action, because stillness in the face of a perceived threat feels unbearable to a nervous system built for fight or flight rather than patient reflection. Chasing offers the illusion of action, a false sense that something is being done to resolve the danger, when in reality it almost always accelerates the very outcome the man fears most. Desmond found it useful to name this alarm explicitly whenever it surfaced, telling himself plainly that his nervous system was reacting to loss the way it might react to a physical threat, and that the correct response to a false alarm was not obedience but patience. Recognizing the biological machinery beneath the emotional urge did not eliminate the urge entirely, but it gave Desmond a crucial half-second of distance between feeling and action, and that half-second, repeated consistently, was often enough to prevent the message from being sent at all. Principle 2. Walking away requires somewhere worth walking toward. Silence without direction quickly curdles into stagnation. A man who simply stops chasing but has nothing else occupying his attention will find the vacuum filling itself with obsessive thoughts about the very person he claims to have released. This is why walking away only works when there is genuinely somewhere to walk toward, a life, a purpose, a set of disciplines pulling his attention forward rather than avoid pulling his attention backward. Diogenes lived with almost nothing, yet reported being wealthier than kings, because his contentment was rooted entirely in the philosophy he practiced daily, a direction he walked toward regardless of what anyone around him thought or did. Desmond needed his own version of that direction, something substantial enough to absorb the energy chasing had previously consumed. He found it, somewhat by accident, in a certification course for structural engineering he had been postponing for over a year, always citing lack of time as the excuse. With his evenings suddenly empty of the calls and messages he used to send, he enrolled within his first month of practicing silence, and the coursework became a genuine anchor, difficult enough to demand focus, rewarding enough to produce visible progress he could track. Seneca wrote extensively about the value of purposeful occupation, warning that idle time left unstructured becomes the breeding ground for every anxious thought a man is trying to escape. Desmond's evenings filled with study instead of surveillance, his weekends filled with practice exams instead of drive-bys disguised as coincidence. Walking away became easier not because he stopped feeling the pull backward, but because something forward finally exerted a stronger pull than the past could manage. Direction does not need to be dramatic to be effective. Desmond initially assumed his forward momentum needed to look impressive from the outside, a bold career change, a dramatic physical transformation, something worthy of being noticed and admired. He later realized this assumption was simply another disguised form of performing for an audience, still hoping his direction would eventually be witnessed and validated by the very person he claimed to be walking away from. The certification course worked precisely because it was unglamorous, private, and entirely disconnected from any hope of being seen. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself repeatedly that a task done well, quietly, without need for recognition, held more value than any accomplishment performed for applause. Desmond's evenings of technical study, difficult and often tedious, built a kind of quiet confidence no dramatic gesture could have matched, precisely because the work was done entirely for himself, judged by no standard except his own steady progress through material that demanded his full attention and rewarded him only with competence, not admiration. If this framework is already reshaping how you think about your own situation, take a moment right now and subscribe to Quotes Library. This channel exists specifically for men doing this exact work, rebuilding direction after loss, and we release new material regularly built entirely around helping you walk forward with genuine purpose. Principle 3. Silence must be total to be believed. Half measures destroy the credibility of silence faster than almost anything else. A man who goes quiet for 2 weeks and then likes an old photo, comments on a recent post, or sends a message disguised as checking in has not practiced silence at all. He has simply spaced out his chasing into a slower, more deniable rhythm, and people notice this pattern instantly, even when they cannot articulate why it feels insincere. True silence requires total commitment, the removal of every small digital gesture that functions as a disguised bid for attention. Machiavelli understood that half-hearted actions often produce worse outcomes than no action at all, because they reveal intention without accomplishing anything, leaving a man exposed without any corresponding gain. Desmond learned this lesson through a painful, minor mistake 3 weeks into his new discipline. He had gone completely silent, no calls, no messages, no drive-bys, and felt genuinely proud of the consistency, until one evening, scrolling absent-mindedly, he liked a photo Ifoma had posted months earlier, an old habit triggered by muscle memory rather than intention. Within an hour, he received a message from her asking if he was doing okay, a message that on the surface seemed kind but underneath confirmed exactly what his silence had been trying to disprove. That he was still watching, still present, still available the moment any small opening appeared. Desmond deleted the app that night, not from anger but from clear-eyed recognition that total silence meant total removal of temptation, not simply willpower exercised against constant exposure. A king does not leave the castle gates slightly open and call it a fortress. Silence, to be believed by anyone, including yourself, must be complete. The deletion of the app was, in a strange way, one of the most instructive moments of Desmond's entire recovery, because it forced him to confront how much of his silence had actually depended on convenience rather than genuine discipline. It is easy to feel disciplined when temptation sits 3 taps away and you simply choose not to make those taps. It is a different, deeper discipline entirely to remove the temptation structurally, accepting the mild inconvenience of a slower path back into old habits as the price of genuine consistency. Seneca often advised his students to remove themselves physically from situations that tested their resolve unnecessarily, understanding that willpower is a finite resource best conserved for genuine tests rather than spent repeatedly resisting easily avoidable triggers. Desmond's decision to delete rather than merely resist became a template he applied elsewhere, removing saved numbers, unfollowing shared social circles temporarily, restructuring his commute to avoid familiar streets entirely. None of this was extreme. All of it simply acknowledged an honest truth about human willpower. It performs far better when architecture supports it than when it is left to battle temptation unaided, exposed to triggers a wiser structure would have simply removed in advance. Principle 4. Respect cannot be requested, only demonstrated. Many men, in the aftermath of being left, make the mistake of explaining why they deserve respect, listing their good qualities, their sacrifices, their loyalty, as though respect were a debt owed and simply needing collection. This approach fails every time, because respect functions entirely differently from a financial transaction. It cannot be requested into existence through argument. It can only be demonstrated through consistent conduct observed over time, ideally conduct that requires no explanation because it speaks entirely for itself. Marcus Aurelius never wrote his Meditations for an audience, he wrote them as private instruction to himself, and the fact that they eventually commanded the respect of millions across centuries had nothing to do with him ever explaining his own worthiness to anyone. Desmond stopped explaining himself somewhere around his 2nd month of practiced silence, not through a conscious decision but through the natural byproduct of having less and less need to justify his behavior once his behavior became genuinely consistent. He no longer felt the urge to clarify misunderstandings that reached him secondhand through mutual friends, no longer felt compelled to correct assumptions about why he had gone quiet. His coursework progressed. His discipline around fitness returned after months of neglect. His friendships, which had grown thin during the relationship's final anxious stretch, slowly thickened again as he showed up consistently instead of canceling plans to monitor his phone. None of this was performed for Ifoma's benefit, yet word of it inevitably traveled the way word always travels through shared social circles, and the respect that reached her eventually was not the respect he had once tried to argue for. It was respect earned through months of conduct she had simply witnessed from a distance, unsolicited and therefore, for the first time, entirely credible. There is a broader lesson here that extends well beyond romantic situations, one Desmond began applying to his professional life almost immediately once he recognized the pattern. He had spent years over-explaining himself to a difficult supervisor, justifying decisions before they were questioned, preemptively defending his competence in meetings where no one had actually challenged it. This habit, he realized, sprang from the exact same insecurity that had driven his chasing, a belief that respect required active defense rather than quiet demonstration. He began applying his new discipline at work as well, letting his completed projects speak without lengthy justification, answering direct questions honestly but declining to volunteer defensive explanations nobody had requested. His supervisor's attitude toward him shifted noticeably within a few months. not because Desmond had changed his actual competence, but because he had stopped signaling insecurity through unnecessary explanation. This is the wider application of the principle. Respect, whether romantic, professional, or social, responds to demonstrated consistency far more reliably than it responds to argument, and a man who learns this lesson in one area of his life often finds it transferring naturally into every other area as well. Principle 5. The body keeps the discipline the mind cannot always sustain. Willpower alone rarely survives sustained emotional pressure. A man relying purely on mental resolve to resist the urge to chase will eventually encounter a night weak enough to override every intention formed in calmer moments. This is precisely why the ancient philosophers paired their intellectual disciplines with physical ones, understanding intuitively what modern research now confirms explicitly. A well-regulated body produces a more stable mind, and a stable mind resists impulsive behavior far more reliably than sheer determination ever could. Marcus Aurelius trained with his legions. Seneca practiced daily walks as a component of clear thinking, not as a separate hobby from his philosophy but as an extension of it. Desmond's recovery accelerated dramatically once he restructured his physical routine around consistency rather than intensity. He began running at 6 each morning, not for dramatic transformation but simply to establish an anchor point his day could organize around, a commitment that required him to sleep at reasonable hours and eat with enough intention to fuel the effort. Within 6 weeks, he noticed something unexpected. The late-night urges to check her social media, once nearly unbearable, had grown noticeably quieter. Not because the feelings themselves had vanished but because his body, properly rested and physically regulated, no longer amplified every emotional spike into a crisis demanding immediate action. This is the truth almost nobody explains clearly enough to men in Desmond's position. Emotional discipline is far easier to sustain from inside a well-cared-for body than from inside a depleted, sleep-deprived, poorly fed one. Build the physical foundation first, and the mental discipline you are chasing becomes dramatically more achievable. There is also a symbolic weight to physical discipline that operates independently of its measurable biological benefits. Waking before sunrise to run, regardless of motivation or mood, becomes a daily ritual of proof, evidence collected each morning that a man is still capable of doing hard things on purpose, even when nobody is watching and no external reward awaits him beyond the simple fact of having done it. Desmond noticed that the days he skipped this ritual were consistently the days his discipline felt weakest in every other area as well, as though the morning run functioned as a keystone holding the rest of his structure together. Epictetus taught that we train ourselves for larger tests through smaller, deliberately chosen ones, treating minor daily discomforts as practice for the genuine trials life will eventually demand. A cold, difficult morning run is a small trial, chosen voluntarily, that builds exactly the kind of resolve needed for the much larger, involuntary trial of walking away from someone he still loved. The body, in this sense, became Desmond's training ground for the mind, each small physical victory compounding into a broader capacity for restraint he could not have accessed through willpower alone. You are exactly the kind of viewer this channel was built for, someone willing to sit with difficult truths long enough to actually apply them to a real life. Subscribe to Quotes Library so you never miss the next lesson, and help us reach the next 1,000 men who need exactly this message today. Principle 6. Loneliness is not an emergency. Modern life has trained men to treat loneliness as a crisis requiring immediate resolution, a fire that must be extinguished through any available means, whether that means chasing an ex-partner, seeking distraction through casual encounters, or numbing the discomfort through endless entertainment. The Stoics understood loneliness very differently, as an ordinary and survivable condition, uncomfortable but never genuinely dangerous, and certainly not a state requiring desperate action to escape. Epictetus reminded his students constantly that discomfort itself does not harm us, only our exaggerated judgment about discomfort creates the suffering we actually experience. A man who can sit with loneliness without treating it as an emergency gains an extraordinary advantage over one who cannot, because he stops making decisions from a place of panic. Desmond's hardest weekends were the quiet ones, Saturday evenings with no plans, no distractions, nothing but the apartment and his own thoughts, which had previously sent him reaching for his phone within the first restless hour. He began practicing something almost deceptively simple, sitting with the discomfort deliberately, timing himself, noticing that the unbearable urge to reach out always peaked somewhere around the 20-minute mark and then, reliably, began to fade if left unaddressed. This pattern repeated itself enough times that Desmond began to trust it, the way a swimmer eventually trusts that a current, however strong it initially feels, will not actually pull him under if he simply stops panicking and lets his body float. Loneliness, treated as ordinary weather rather than emergency, loses much of its power over a man's decisions. It becomes something to be endured for 20 minutes rather than something requiring immediate rescue through behavior he will regret by morning. Desmond eventually discovered that loneliness, examined honestly rather than fled from immediately, often carried information worth hearing rather than simply discomfort worth escaping. Sitting through those difficult Saturday evenings, he began noticing patterns in what specifically made the silence feel unbearable, and often the answer had little to do with Ifoma directly and much more to do with old habits of avoidance stretching back well before the relationship had even begun. He recognized a long-standing pattern of filling quiet moments with distraction rather than reflection, a pattern that had nothing to do with any particular partner and everything to do with a general discomfort toward being alone with his own thoughts. This recognition became one of the most valuable byproducts of the entire ordeal, because it meant the discipline he was building extended far beyond recovering from one relationship. He was, without initially realizing it, addressing a pattern that would have eventually surfaced in some other form regardless of who left or when. Loneliness treated as a teacher rather than an enemy often reveals exactly this kind of foundational insight, information about a man's relationship with himself that comfortable distraction had always kept safely hidden. Principle 7. Let her absence teach the lesson your presence never could. There is a peculiar, almost paradoxical truth embedded in walking away. Your absence often communicates more than your presence ever managed to, precisely because absence forces reflection in a way constant availability never requires. When a man is always present, always reachable, always ready to explain and reassure, the person on the receiving end never has to sit with the discomfort of missing him, because he never actually leaves long enough for missing to occur. Seneca observed that we rarely value what remains constantly within reach, and it is only through genuine scarcity that value becomes visible again. Desmond's consistent availability throughout the relationship's final months had inadvertently taught Ifoma that he would always be there regardless of how she treated the connection, removing any incentive for her to examine what she actually wanted. His silence changed that equation entirely, not through manipulation but through the simple, honest fact of his absence creating space where reflection could finally occur. Word reached Desmond, months into his new discipline, that Ifoma had mentioned him unprompted during a conversation with a mutual friend, wondering aloud whether ending things had been the right decision, a question she had never once voiced during the months he was actively trying to convince her to reconsider. This is the lesson so many men resist because it requires relinquishing control. Sometimes the most persuasive argument you can make is the argument you never make at all, communicated entirely through the simple, undeniable fact of your absence and the space it leaves behind for someone to finally notice what they are missing. Principle 8. Never mistake her return for your victory. If the moment eventually arrives when the person who left reaches back out, curious, reflective, perhaps even regretful, there is a final trap waiting for the unprepared man, mistaking her return as validation that his entire worth depended on this outcome all along. This trap undoes months of genuine growth in a single evening, because it reveals that the discipline was never truly internalized, only performed as an elaborate, patient strategy aimed at exactly this moment. Marcus Aurelius warned against attaching happiness to outcomes beyond our control, and a reunion, however welcome, remains an outcome entirely outside a man's control until the moment it actually occurs. The man who has genuinely done this work treats her potential return with the same equanimity he applied to her departure. Welcome if it happens, evaluated honestly rather than desperately, but never treated as the missing piece that finally completes him. Desmond faced this exact test nearly 7 months after his silence began, when Ifoma reached out asking to talk. He noticed the old excitement rise immediately, the temptation to treat this message as proof that everything he had built was simply a means to this particular end. He sat with that excitement for 2 full days before responding, applying the same discipline he had practiced throughout his silence, examining the impulse rather than obeying it instantly. When they finally spoke, he approached the conversation not as a man desperate for restoration but as a man genuinely curious whether the relationship, honestly examined by 2 changed people, made sense to rebuild. That distinction, subtle but enormous, is the entire difference between a man who walked away and grew, and a man who simply waited in expensive disguise for his chasing to finally pay off. The conversation itself surprised Desmond, not because it resolved neatly into reconciliation, but because he found himself genuinely unattached to any particular outcome by the time it happened. He listened to Ifoma's reflections on the months apart with real curiosity rather than desperate hope, noticing details about her growth and her uncertainty without needing any of it to point toward a specific conclusion he had been secretly hoping for. This is the quiet payoff of months of genuine discipline. By the time the test actually arrives, it often does not feel like a test at all, simply a conversation between two people examining reality honestly. Whether they eventually rebuilt something together or simply parted with mutual respect matters less to this lesson than the internal state Desmond had achieved by the time the question was finally asked. He no longer needed a particular answer to feel whole. That, more than any reunion or its absence, was the actual victory the entire discipline had been building toward from the very first silent evening he chose not to knock on her door. Principle 9. Build a standard, not just a recovery. Most men treat this entire process as a temporary repair, a set of disciplines applied only until the pain subsides enough to return to old patterns of behavior. This is a costly mistake, because it treats the growth as circumstantial rather than foundational, something summoned only during crisis and abandoned the moment life feels comfortable again. Marcus Aurelius did not practice his philosophy only during the plague years or only while grieving. He practiced it as a daily standard, applied consistently whether circumstances were calm or catastrophic, because he understood that character built only under pressure and discarded during comfort was never truly character at all, merely a temporary performance summoned by necessity. The disciplines Desmond built, the silence, the physical structure, the willingness to sit with discomfort rather than flee it, were only valuable long-term if they became a permanent standard rather than a temporary emergency response. Desmond made a deliberate decision, somewhere around his 5th month of practice, to continue every discipline he had built even as the acute pain of the breakup faded into something more manageable. He kept training at 6 each morning long after the anxious energy that once demanded it had settled. He kept his notebook of noticed impulses, applying it now to entirely different situations, professional frustrations, minor social slights, the ordinary friction of daily life that had once triggered impulsive reactions he later regretted. This shift, from crisis management to permanent standard, marked the true completion of his transformation. A man who only walks away silently when heartbroken has learned a useful coping mechanism. A man who walks away silently is a standing principle, applied to every situation where chasing approval would compromise his dignity, has built something far more valuable, a character that no longer requires crisis to access its own discipline. The final word: real men do not chase, not because chasing is beneath them, but because chasing rarely accomplishes what desperation hopes it will, and because a man's energy is far too valuable a resource to spend pursuing anyone unwilling to be caught. Walking away silently requires somewhere genuine to walk toward, a discipline substantial enough to absorb the energy chasing once consumed. It requires total silence rather than partial withdrawal, respect demonstrated through conduct rather than argued through explanation, and a body cared for well enough to sustain the mental discipline the situation demands. It requires treating loneliness as ordinary discomfort rather than emergency, trusting absence to communicate what presence never could, and, if the door eventually reopens, walking through it with clear eyes rather than desperate relief. Desmond's story is not unusual. It is simply what happens whenever a man chooses discipline over panic, purpose over pursuit, and self-respect over the exhausting performance of proving his worth to someone who has already, at least for now, stopped watching. If Desmond's story gave you a clearer way to see your own situation, subscribe to Quotes Library right now. This channel exists entirely for men doing exactly this work, translating ancient wisdom into a discipline you can actually apply this week, and every subscriber helps this message reach the next man who needs to hear it tonight. Share this with someone quietly chasing something that has already left. Leave a comment about which principle you needed most today. And when this video ends, close it the way a real man would, without needing anyone's permission, without needing anyone watching, simply walking forward into the life you are building regardless of who eventually notices. Keep becoming.